marginality, epistemological rupture, and theoretical construction. Speaking from Margin is an academic platform for research scholars, socio-political activists, and students to engage with the contemporary discourses in social sciences. It attempts at building academic solidarities for achieving social justice in higher education. We use this space to build learning and support groups among researchers from various marginal locations to engage with evolving knowledge paradigms within multiple disciplines of contemporary social sciences. In the past, we have organized several lectures and book discussions which have received overwhelming responses from the academic community and beyond. Our past speakers include Professor Kancha Illaiah, Professor Rajeev Bhargava, Professor Satish Deshpande, Professor Nandini Sundar, Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury, Professor Zoya Hasan, Dr. Nasreen Chowdhury, Dr. Rahul Verma, Professor Neera Chandoke, Professor N. Sukumar, Dr. Sudhir Kumar Suthar, Professor Maitrayee Chaudhuri, Professor Anvita Abbi, among others. Through our Margin Speaks lecture series, we try to bring to our audience and participants the opportunity to interact with experts from various social science disciplines with the objective of facilitating aspiring researchers in getting a better hold of contemporary debates in social sciences and equip themselves better with a variety of issues lying therein. The series is also an attempt on our part to bring to the fore certain issues which have hitherto remained at the margins of the mainstream academia and initiate conversations along those lines among the academic community and beyond. Today, we are extremely delighted to have you all here with us, along with our esteemed speakers who took out their time to be a part of our one such small effort. To begin our today's discussion, we have our first session on cultural rights and spatiality of citizenship deficit. The timing for this session could not have been any better, as the social sciences have once again started to grapple with the concept of citizenship afresh and its relationship to the rights of multiple groups existing under a single polity. Among the multiple panoplies of rights available to the citizens of a multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual democracy like ours, comes up the issue of cultural rights, which has bewildered the political regime since forever. Citizenship is not only a question of difference, it's equally a question about hierarchy, discrimination, segregation, and marginalization. There is no contestation over the fact that rights are fundamental for securing equal citizenship to all individuals and groups. But one can still ask the question, are cultural rights as equally fundamental as economic and political rights towards individuals' realization as dignified and equal citizens? At a time when nation-states are becoming more and more homogenized in their imagination, as well as how they deal with the population living inside their borders, every discussion on cultural rights is seen nothing less than a red signal, which has the potential of fracturing such a homogenized imagination. Spaces are central to any imagination and become more significant when one talks about imagining an institution as important and yet as vague as a nation state. Spatially speaking, what is a nation state? How does it feel to be a part of it as people and as citizens? Are our much romanticized images of Indian villages equally hospitable for people from all kinds of castes, gender, and sexual identities? Do our urban spaces, cities and metropoles open up their arms equally for everyone, giving everyone a sense of belonging by being emancipatory? Or do people carry the burden of their identities all the way to these relatively secular and egalitarian spaces as well, to face further marginalization and discrimination, albeit of different kinds? Thus, space as a category has something very special and specific to tell us as far as the relationship between what defines belonging, citizenship, and cultural rights are concerned. Does the right to represent or wear one's culture and identity over one's sleeve somehow goes against the idea of uniform citizenship? Or do we need to reimagine the meaning of what citizenship is and should be all about? I hope by the end of this session, we will be able to get better clarity over at least some of these loosely articulated issues. Now, without taking any further time, I would like to invite Avinash to introduce the chair and speaker for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Khushbu. So, now I would like to introduce the speaker and chair for today's first session. As the speaker, we have with us Dr. Ghazala Jamil, Dr. Jamil is an assistant professor at Center for Study of Law and Governance, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her research focuses on studying neoliberal urbanisms, cultural industry, minority and cultural rights, social movements, post-colonial feminisms. She has authored several articles in renowned journals and books, which include Accumulation by Segregation, Muslim Localities in Delhi, Muslim Movement in India Speak, Giving Voice to Dreams and Cycles. Once there was a city named Delhi, which is an English translation of Intizar Hussein's Urdu text, Delhi Tha Jiska Naam, co-translated with Faiz-Ullah. She has also edited a volume titled Women in Social Change, Visions, Struggles and Persisting Concerns, published by Sage in 2021. We welcome you, ma'am, and are eagerly waiting to listen to you. The chair for our today's session is Dr. Nazima Parveen. Dr. Parveen is currently an associate research fellow at Policy Perspective Foundation. She has completed her PhD from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Broadly, her work focuses on rights of ethnic and religious minorities, communalization of space, and the politics of urban transformation in colonial and post-colonial South Asia. She has authored a book titled Contested Homelands, Politics of Space and Identity, has been published by Bloomsbury in 2020. She has also worked as an assistant professor at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and has been a recipient of several scholarships and fellowships, which include Royal Society of New Zealand Doctoral Scholarship and ASIA Fellows Award, among others. We are extremely delighted to welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Now, I would like to request Soria and Harshita to present memento to our today's speaker, Dr. Ghazala Jamil, on behalf of the team of Speaking from Margin. I would also request Anvesh and Nikhil to come and present memento to our chair for this session, Dr. Nazima Parveen. Now, regarding the time frame of discussion, the chair will have 5 minutes at the beginning and 15 minutes at the end to make her comments. The speaker will have 25 minutes of time to give her presentation. Finally, the last 15 minutes are reserved for questions and answers. I request the chair and speaker to be very prudent and precise with their time so that we can save our time for audience as well. Now, without any further delay, I will call Dr. Parveen to chair today's session and lead on the discussion from here on. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be a part of this wonderful initiative, and very good afternoon to all of you. I think this is really important to question the conventional understanding of the margin and the marginality, not from the perspective of the mainstream or the convention or the given theorization or given categories, but especially from the margins perspective. And in that endeavor, I think this initiative is really wonderful, and it's really important to look at how these categories have been given to us, or how these categories have evolved, and how the communities have actually become a victim of these very communities, because these communities come with certain explanations, certain explanatory terms and terminologies. So this is the reason why it's really important to understand and unravel the epistemic violence that because of communalism and the post-colonial politics that we are facing today. And I would now like to invite Professor Ghazala Jamil, and I'm really appreciative of her work. I've read your work. So without wasting much time, off to you.
Thank you to the organizers for this very kind invitations, Professor Sukumar, and all the fellow scholars and researchers here. I'm probably destined to be imprudent in my time management today, partially because I've been unwell, but I still did not want to lose this opportunity to engage with peers. So this paper that I'm presenting today is very much work in progress. There are still edges and arguments that I haven't smoothed over, but I'm still taking the risk to present it in front of you in the hope that I'll get feedback which will help me smoothen the rough edges or the gaps that are there. So it is in that spirit that I present this paper to you. The paper was quite long, and as I've already shared, I've been quite unwell in the last 1 week, so I've not been able to actually decide how much of what will I say, so I'll just roll it, and I request the chair and the organizers to let me know that the time is going to finish maybe about 5 minutes before, 5 to 8 minutes before my time is about to end, so then I'll quickly wrap up. So in terms of citizenship deficit of Muslim community in India, there's so much that is happening which is so contemporary that I think those are the parts that I can mostly elide about, stuff that we all know, and I can assume safely that in terms of the violence that is being unleashed, I won't go into very clinical details of already sharing with you what is there. What I'm trying to do today is to present a fresh framework to look at what is already well known. So in that sense, it's nothing revolutionary. But my hope here is that this framework will spark fresher conversations, sharper ways of responding to some of the challenges thrown up by this citizenship deficit. So in my earlier work on spatial segregation of Muslims in Delhi, I had argued, there were many arguments, but one of the arguments was that citizenship has ceased to be, in the neoliberal world that we are living in, it ceased to be only a status, it's become a capital which some people have and exercise in surplus and others experience a deficit. So I won't go into detail about that. I use this as an opportunity to invite you to read Accumulation by Segregation. But in terms of cultural rights, whenever we are talking about rights, the phrase social, economic, political and cultural is very often used, but in most instances the discussion is limited only to mostly economic and political rights, and sometimes social is thrown in between. But because of their scope, their legal content and enforceability is limited in international law. A commonly held perception about cultural rights is that they are the least developed category of all human rights. In India, in the civil society as well as jurisprudential discourse about rights, cultural rights are paradoxically and simultaneously seen as less valuable, and also they are seen as more contentious than socio-economic or civic rights, where there is more consensus about whether they are valuable or not. So in this paper, I argue that cultural rights actually constitute an arena in which minorities are officially produced in India. And I attempt to show that while citizenship rights of minorities are often challenged and denied through various aspersions related to their cultural identity, specifically in India, the cultural rights themselves have seldom been sharply articulated and discussed. My attempt will be to move beyond the more conventionally debated and studied aspects of cultural rights of minorities, like the personal law, and the paper will focus on which as I said earlier, I'll probably not go into great details of it in this presentation, but the latter part of the paper focuses on spatial forms and manifestations of cultural rights as they are exercised, as they exist in space. The idea is to demonstrate that spatial segregation and marginalization of minorities in post-independent India is rooted at least partially, if not wholly, in the curtailment of cultural rights. What this paper aims to do is to establish that the chronic underestimation of cultural rights in the right discourse produces devastating consequences for communities whose claim of belonging are frequently thwarted by the state and national majorities. As I said earlier, I am trying to forward a framework of minority rights in which cultural rights are positioned centrally, allowing for analytical, sharper debates on the rights of minorities in India and a clearer understanding of the dynamics of cultural nationalism in action. So in the first part of my presentation, which is what I will mostly focus on, I will make brief comments on the position of cultural rights in international law and human rights regime, and I will follow this up with a brief discussion on constitutional provisions for cultural rights in the Constitution of India, and as I argued, the construction of minorities within the constitutional text of the Constitution of India. And in the last part of the presentation, I'll just briefly gesture towards some illustrations which are very, very familiar to all of us, but they are not really discussed in the legal framing of cultural rights. So, the Article 27 of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually states that everyone has the right to freely participate in cultural life of community, to enjoy the arts and to share scientific advancement and its benefit. Cultural rights, therefore, are inseparable from human rights as recognized in Article 5 of 2001 UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity and can be defined as the right to access to, participation in and enjoyment of culture. Now this includes the right of individuals and communities to get to know, to understand, to visit, to make use of, to maintain, to exchange and to develop cultural heritage and cultural expressions as well as of their own and as well as benefit from the same from cultural heritage and cultural expressions of other communities. Other human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, and this is very important when I come to the discussion on the Constitution of India, freedom of expression, along with right to information and right to education are the key to realization of cultural rights. So without freedom of expression, without various freedoms, cultural rights cannot be exercised. Now, a specific debate on cultural rights actually in international law got traction very late, like in 1990s. And here they were always, qualified as underdeveloped category of human rights. And it was suggested that in comparison with other categories of human rights, these were least developed because their scope, their legal content, and their enforceability was limited. Now, this point of view may be challenged as the existing list of cultural rights is relatively exhausted. So if you Google a little bit and see what all is the content of cultural rights, you'll see important stuff like, for example, habitat rights. So, especially tribal communities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, the issue of belonging and habitat rights is most germane to cultural rights. And often in India, as I said, in jurisprudential discourse where cultural rights are being sort of debated within various legal cases, It's often, dubbed even in civil society in India as very backward-looking, as not being, secular, as not being modern, and because these relate mostly to traditional and therefore unmodern, ideas. Now, but as I said, please remember that the freedom of expression and right to freedom of expression is one of the most important prerequisites for expression of and exercise of cultural rights. Now, what is certainly true that although the expression is, economic, social, and cultural rights is widely used, it is the concern appears to be limited to economic and social rights, and rather than being underdeveloped, it's actually the poor cousin treatment kind that is often accorded to cultural rights. So it's not that they are underdeveloped, but because they are not rights that are considered, uncontentious, unchallenged even within international law. And one of the things that makes these rights actually very difficult to discuss in international law is the fact that these rights are mostly where minorities are produced, not only in Indian law but also in international law. And the moment the rights of minorities is invoked, there's always a specter of this, undermining subnationalisms and undermining sovereignty of member states of UN or any other, state entity. So, and this aspect is something that can be observed not only state practice, that minorities are marginalized, that they are not accorded rights, and the rights that are specific to them, which are mostly cultural rights, because and how it is, culture is something that belongs to cultural minorities, because the culture of majority is actually not really seen as culture, it's seen as the norm. So it's the same as, for example, caste is something that is experienced by only lower caste, so-called lower caste people, and it is assumed that upper caste people don't experience caste, which actually is caste privilege. So similarly, religious is something that is exercised and practiced by religious minorities, whereas religious majorities and their religious symbols and their religious practices are the norm, and therefore they're not highlighted as such. So this is something which is observed not only in state practice, but also in the doctrine, in the text, as we will see in Indian constitution also. But this is not just something that is pertaining to India only, and one can hardly find a state constitution which has a chapter dealing comprehensively with cultural rights, and this is true for all written constitutions of the world. And in majority of the cases, the constitutions actually limit themselves to mentioning the right to education in consonance with cultural rights wherever it's mentioned. Otherwise, education rights are actually considered to be the beginning and end of cultural rights. And in my view, one way to understand this undermining of cultural rights is the tension between cultural rights and human rights, gender rights and women's rights being one which is always flagged, but also the supremacy of national sovereignty and the state sovereignty is the other thing that is often challenged by the very idea of cultural rights. So the special, one more issue that's important for Indian constitutional provisions is that while individuals can have cultural rights, but culture is actually essentially connected to communities and shared community heritage. So in a largely liberal constitution, community rights in any case, or rights that are vested in communities, even though the locus always is the individual, these rights tend to become, difficult. And one of the fears in the way of cultural rights is the suspicion of the states that the recognition of the right to different cultural identities or the right of identification with vulnerable groups, in particularly religious minorities and indigenous people, may encourage the tendency towards secession and may endanger national unity. So if you see the debates about uniform civil code, etc., the most important logic that is often given is national unity. Also in the doctrine of law, the idea of one nation, one blah blah. How there's so many of these things. So even in law, diversity and plurality is something that is frowned upon, because any diversity and any plurality, and this is in discourse, this is a relatively new thing in India, but as I'll show in doctrine, it's not really new. So we are more blatantly talking about it, and I think there's more honesty about it, but it's something that is lingered on as what Neera Chandoke has called the long shadow of the partition of India, specifically when it relates to Muslims' rights. So this idea of endangering national unity is the reason that the introduction of cultural rights in the Charter of the United Nations was actually blocked during the San Francisco Conference in 1945. And the reason that the cultural rights of persons belonging to minorities are not mentioned by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They were only recognized by Article 27 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And varying degree of cultural rights may be recognized, but the overarching idea was that the cultural rights cannot be used as a justification to limit other human rights enshrined in international law. And the Vienna Declaration, adopted by consensus by the World Conference in 1993, actually confirmed the universality of human rights, explicitly rejected the notion of cultural relativism. So you see, what I'm trying to do is to develop this tension between the idea that everything universal is necessarily, unquestioned, and human rights regime is actually a Western sort of, episteme in which rights regime belonging to non-Western cultures and rights that emanate, or the understanding of cosmology of rights, why people have rights, is something that's not really recognized. But since I'm not challenging that really, in the sense that I understand and I accept that social movements and rights-based movements of minorities of all kinds actually draw from human rights regime and the universality of human rights regime the world over. Having said that, we must recognize that that happens more than partially, also because of the heavy international law paraphernalia of human rights regime. There are courts of law, there are procedures that you can follow, without which actually, if you look at it, minorities in many states such as India today, where there is very little scope for minorities to push back, to assert rights, is very difficult. So if there is a episteme in which it is possible to do, you obviously take advantage of that and to do it. But to assume that that's the divine truth and there's no problem in that, that's something that I'm challenging. That even this idea of universality of human rights is actually flawed, and the reason why cultural rights, especially cultural rights of minorities, are underdeveloped categories of human rights or poor cousins of human rights is because they challenge certain ideas about the hegemony or sort of unquestioned power of the state to rule over lives, but specifically lives of minorities. Now, I mean, I can discuss this in much greater detail, and I do that in the paper. But let me move on to the second part, where I'm going to talk about how minorities are produced in the Constitution of India. Where in the preamble, it actually, the Constitution of India promises to all its citizens liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. And however, there now exist numerous texts which are the readings of the Constitution that discerns how communal discrimination, especially, is inscribed in the text of the Constitution. Article 14 of the Constitution proclaims the principle of equality and equal protection of law for all. And these are this is important for minorities because this equality is secured for everyone, so that minority rights are protected too. So in that sense, the importance that there is equality before law is actually most important for minorities. It's not something that majorities are really bothered about. But Article 14 and upholding of Article 14 is actually something that really bothered, and the space that is being cleared for me to speak as, after following the anti-CA movement was this. So, our Home Minister kept repeating that this is a law, the amendment was a law which was to give citizenship to additional categories of people. It was not a law which took away citizenship from existing citizens, which technically is true. But why was it something that bothered the protesting publics was this, that Article 14, which promised equality before law to everybody, was something that was being challenged. Now, to come to the specific issue of minorities, actually the word minority has been used in the Constitution of India only in Article 29 and Article 30, where also it has not really been defined. So nowhere else does it mention minorities, and this specific mention of is qualified as religious and linguistic minorities and can be construed to be largely in the context of cultural specificity. But how minorities are produced in the Constitution of India is that if you read these two articles along with Article 25 to 28, which provide for right to freedom of conscience and religious liberty, and there are also various other freedoms where, for example, right to follow a certain occupation, freedom of expression, freedom to live anywhere in the country, to buy property. The right to life itself has been very extensively expanded by the Supreme Court of India to include many of the rights which are sort of contravened by publics in India, majoritarian violence, etc., that does that. Now, if you particularly look at the question of who's a Hindu in India, you will realize that how minorities are construed in India. So if you look at the case of Jains, and there's a lot of literature on how Jains came to be recognized as minorities in India, along with, in actually 2014, along with Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Zoroastrian. And this is one of the last things that the UPA government did. So when I say 2014, it's not Modi government that did it. It was one of the last things that they did this. And I don't have time to go into the details, but basically there are these different statutes that read together comprise the Hindu personal law, which recognize Jains, Buddhists, and Sikhs as Hindus in law. Right? So they are minorities otherwise, but in law, especially related to succession, etc., they are actually recognized as Hindus. And we also know that for laws that are related to reservation, how Buddhists and Sikhs have actually been included in the definition, whereas so the schism between the so-called Indic religions and non-Indic religions is there. And not only these two arenas, but also in taxation law, if you look at the definition of who's a Hindu in the law related to Hindu undivided family, you will see that it actually reproduces that same schism. Now, what the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 does is actually that it reproduces the same schism between Indic and non-Indic religions, partially, I mean not wholly, because they included Christians in this thing, and only Muslims were sort of excluded out of the definition. So, and this is something that the exclusion of Muslims or the changing definition of who's a citizen of India, but to the fact of who can be a citizen of India, right? So there are categories of people who are eligible to apply for citizenship of India, and it is that part of the citizenship law which has been changing for a very long time now, and how illegal migrants to India and the procedure through which they will claim citizenship to India is the part which you have to read in order to understand how Muslims have been excluded out of this, contravening their equal status in the Constitution of India given by Article 14. Again, I don't have time to go into the details of that, but when we look at cultural rights and when we look at any community's cultural heritage, how are they supposed to actually enjoy the cultural heritage, and what are the ways in which they exercise the right to culture? And one of the most germane thing to this, which is recognized even in Indian law, pertaining to indigenous communities and Adivasi communities, forest rights, etc., is the fact that there is an inalienable right that these communities have to belong to that territory, the place, that they belong there, that belonging or connection to the geographical place or the territory is germane to their exercise of their culture, without which they neither have any social rights, they neither have any economic rights, and of course political rights, we understand that. Now, what really struck me hard, and that's one of the, although I don't have time to go into the details, but the proposal that I have here is that where are laws that actually recognize Muslim belonging to India? And if you see the discourse of anti-CAA movement, it was that we belong to this country, right? We belong to this country because, some people said, well, our ancestors are buried here. Or, we chose to be here. Even when the partition of India took place, we are the ones who did not go over to Pakistan. We did not believe in a theocratic Muslim South Asian state. Now, funny thing is that if you look at Pakistani citizenship law, or for that matter, if you look at Bangladeshi citizenship law, you would realize that these are not really meant any longer to be a homeland for South Asian Muslims, right? So it's not that, for example, hypothetically speaking, I could get into trouble for saying this, but if, for example, people have been telling me to go to Pakistan and I decide one fine day that, okay, enough is enough, I will go to Pakistan. Can I? No. There is no pathway in Pakistani citizenship law which will enable a person like me to claim citizenship of Pakistan. And if you look at the partition of Pakistan in the 70s and the creation of Bangladesh, you would realize that, yeah, my time is up. So, in the end, what I will say is that when we talk about land rights, when we talk about habitat rights, when we talk about housing rights, and now of course it's even more difficult, but in one sense it's easier to talk about these things because Article 20 and Article 21 of Indian Constitution cannot be suspended even during emergency. That's the law. What do they say? They say it's about freedom of life, it's about freedom of, it's about liberty, right? You cannot punish anybody more than what the crime, the punishment entailed for that crime in the existing law of India. What does the summary demolition of houses mean? Just because they belong to a person of a certain identity. So habitat rights as the core of cultural rights are something that I think is the framework in which we need to begin to talk about minority rights, and especially Muslim Muslim minorities' rights, but also in the paper, and if there will be time in the discussion later, but the issue of falsification of history and erasure of Muslim heritage from the face of Indian territory by renaming the names of places, and that's something that this idea that a rose by any name is a rose still, and all that discussion that takes place, moving on and things change and so on. But these are germane to the erasure governance that we are seeing, and the very nationalist urban development that we are seeing everywhere in this country is something that I've discussed in further detail in the paper. But it was important for me to put forward this legal framing of cultural rights in order to discuss this. And as I said, I'm just assuming that all of you know the rest of the discussion pretty well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nazara Jamil. It was really painful to stop your wonderful paper. But one of the important things that your paper has highlighted is the question of minority. I think this has been the most compelling and most complex issue, not in the contemporary politics only, but from the colonial period too, to how to define what is the definition of a minority, not only in terms of the political representation, but also in terms of cultural rights. So during the colonial period, and it very much correlates with the way state recognizes its citizens, the categories that state uses to identify its citizens. So if we look at the colonial state, the state actually recognized the Indian subject as Hindus and Muslims as the primary identity of those individuals or the communities, and we see that was the official identity of the Indian subjects from the perspective of colonial policies. But we see that the independent Indian state actually very consciously rejected the category of religion to be identified as a prime marker of identity. But what we see, and your paper actually talks about that we see a gradual transformation in the official categorization of individuals. So what we see that the independent state actually rejected that category. So we are a secular state. We are equal citizens, equal modern citizens. But what we see, especially after the 1980s, that there is a gradual shift in the official discourse as well, specifically with the formation of this personal law board. Then there are certain laws which were brought out for a good reason, like the Minority Commissions Act and the Minority Institutions Act. So basically, Minority Commissions Act actually, for the first time, defined 5 religious groups as national minorities, and indirectly it also established Hindu as the national majority. So that has a very different kind of political manifestation, and we saw that after the 1990s, in the wake of the backdrop of Ram Janmabhoomi Ayodhya controversy, we see that how that category of religion has been actually brought back to the forefront, and the CA is actually an example of that, how the citizenship right has been, the definition of citizenship right has been, continuously changed to be defined as on the basis of religious identity or religious community. Now, I would like, without wasting much time, I would like to now open for the question-answer session. And it will be really good if we can get 2-3 questions in one go, and then that will be easier to respond. So, okay.
So,
Your name, please.
I'm Yogita. Yeah. So, from what we read that the directive principles of state policy do not enjoy that higher status as compared to the fundamental rights. And in the framing of constitution, the one place where the minority, as you said, are mentioned are the fundamental rights. And you also said that how the cultural rights receive a step-cousin treatment in comparison to the socio-economic rights as is practiced. But if you see, largely the socio-economic rights are mentioned and enumerated in the directive principles, and as such they are not given as higher priority as the fundamental rights. In such a situation, how do then, in terms of constitutional framing, do we say that the cultural rights do not enjoy that higher status as the socio-economic rights?
Any other question? Yes.
My name is Jate. I just wanted to ask how you differentiate between cultural rights and customary rights. As you said that cultural rights are recognized of late in 1990s, but there in law customary rights have been recognized, and even there are cases in colonial India where customary rights have been given to tribals. Thank you.
From the website.
This is Gopi. One hand, Constitution of India guaranteed to citizenship or under Article 14. The other hand, there is the contradiction of the belief system in India, especially in between the one community to other community. For example, I would like to bring in front of you that the especially the food culture, especially the beef, So one community believes that it is a sacred, especially for the caste Hindus. The other hand, the marginal sections from this country also, like it is a part of their cultural way of life. So how do you understand this? The contradiction of the beliefs, and at the same time the deficit of the citizenship under Constitution of India.
Sure. Would you like to respond to these 3 questions first?
Can I just add something?
Okay.
Recently, you also wrote Muslim counter publics, I think, in India Forum, Muslim women counter publics. There you had commented on for them the segregation of Muslim issues from Muslim women's issues does not make sense. So how do you see this in the cultural narrative rights where the whole Muslim issue is
the third question, I'm sorry, I didn't really understand. Can you elaborate a little bit what you...
Yes, ma'am.
What do you mean that there is contradiction? That there are differences and there's diversity, that's it. Then?
The problem is that, when someone is having their own food, so, they're simply, on the name of the, cultural dominance, certain communities are being killed or attacked.
Yeah, okay.
So how do the same constitution is guaranteeing the rights for everybody. The other hand,
Well, it's not really the constitution that says that if you hate somebody eating something, you can go and kill them.
But that is a whole deficit of the
I know what you're saying. Okay. So, Yogita, I actually didn't say that cultural rights are, given underdeveloped in Indian constitution. What I meant was that in international law, cultural rights are not really, considered or given a lot of focus, partially because there is this nervousness that that the member states of the UN organizations are going to not like that. So if you look at, for example, various issues related to racial discrimination, and Government of India has not been signatory, or they've basically held on and they said caste is not really race. So wherever there is a question of certain kinds of minorities, numerical minorities, religious minorities, or in this case caste minorities, they assert members, and I'm not talking only about India, but basically member states are like, this is about ours, घर की बात है, हमारे घर में ही रहनी चाहिए, we don't want to discuss this. So minorities के बारे में जो भी issues हैं, वो क्योंकि cultural rights are germane to that, and this is the reason why, that's the main force in my article, that cultural rights are underdeveloped in international law, because that's where minorities can actually push back a little bit, and that's where they don't want to, member states, they don't want to talk about it. Now in Indian constitution, there are actually various freedoms and rights given to all citizens of India, which can be construed as cultural rights. So when we are saying freedom of expression, freedom of information, knowledge, definitely it's within the cultural rights. So heritage, etc. Where do you want to live? All of this is germane to freedom of religion. I mean, again, given to all. So it's not, freedom of religion is not just for minorities. Freedom of religion is for all citizens of India. So in Indian constitution, there are extensive cultural rights given to all citizens of India. Then there are specific cultural rights, especially related to educational institution and management and running of educational institution, where they mention minorities. But Article 29 is actually quite vague, because the title says minorities, and within the text of the article itself, there is no mention of minorities, and it actually gives that right to everybody, where they say will protect all, cultural heritage and no discrimination against anybody for getting into, attaining education, etc. So you're right. So my argument is not that in Indian constitution. My argument is that in Indian constitution, minorities are being produced again in arena of cultural rights, where they're saying, well, who's a minority? And they say actually that, and you look at, I've given 2-3 examples where it's the distinction being made is, these are religions that do not belong to India, and therefore we are going to again and again exclude them. And so the religion is used as a marker, but what are they being excluded out of is actually their civil and political and economic rights. So you look at Hindu undivided family. What does it do? It says, well, who's a Hindu? And in these words, it says, not explicit, I'm not quoting it verbatim, but it basically says that if you're not a Parsi, if you're not a Muslim, if you're not a Christian, then you're a Hindu. And you get this opportunity to accrue wealth, right? So the cultural identity is being used to exclude out of accruing of wealth. If you go to principles of state policy, I think, it's actually, there's and the question of beef especially. So if you look at the directive principles of state policy, one of the things that it has also is about scientific management of cattle, etc., etc. Now that's I don't know if many of you have paid attention to this. It's a really interesting thing that they've parked there and left it there. What does it mean? They could have said, if you ask me, one of the ways in which this whole issue of beef and the issue of holy cow could have been dealt with is for India to have said, well, cow is a holy animal for the majority of India, so let us not butcher cow and let us not eat beef. And actually in the Constituent Assembly, certain Muslim members actually said this. They said, why don't you just say that? Say it and we'll be fine with it. But why couldn't they say it? They couldn't say it because India was also poised to be a secular republic. It wanted its citizens to not give in to superstition. It wanted to promote scientific attitude and so on. But there were still members in the Constituent Assembly who could not let go of the issue of, this beef. So they couched it in this scientific language and parked it in the directive principles of state policy, and they said, well, that's how we look after our cattle and this and that. So here's the problem, that we want to be something, we aspire to be something, and it's, in my opinion as a Muslim scholar, it's great that they did not give in to that pressure at that point of time. And obviously this constitutional text is a text of compromises, etc., etc. So there right in front of you is this big compromise. And but the issue is so difficult that it doesn't really go away, and that contradiction that you are using is actually sitting right in the Constitution of India. So how can we expect that contradiction will not keep rising its head again and again in Indian politics when we have not been able to sort of deal with it in the constitutional text? Customary rights and gender rights. Now, gender rights, in that article or any other work that I've done on Muslim women in India, you will see that, Muslim women cannot speak of any issue in Indian public sphere, but for it to become a controversy about Islam. So you say anything you say, and it will be made a controversy about Islam. And the idea is that Islam somehow is a more regressive religion than any other religion in the world. And Muslim men are more patriarchal and violently patriarchal than any other men in the world. Right? That's the assumption that everybody works with, whether you like it or not, whether you confess to it or not. Now, it's a problem. Especially today, it's a problem because Muslim women also, as I write in that article, are contending with the idea or the question that are all men equally powerful? No, they're not. And do men also not have bodies? Over which you can see that the state of India, when it comes to Muslim men's bodies, it unleashes all kinds of violence, including sexual violence, in custody, torture. So all kinds of. So you tell us, what is it that counts and defines as women's issues? And Muslim women are saying, we will not go by your definition of what counts as women's issues. Women's issues, issues that concern women are what actually concern them, not because what is written in the books. So for Muslim women or for any other minorities where gender rights are used as a proxy to take away the rights of the entire community, and this has happened in international politics. Gender rights and emancipating, women in global south has been the war cry of the global north. So many wars have been justified because America wanted to go to Afghanistan and free Muslim women in Afghanistan. Same thing is happening in India. So every time, especially men in this August gathering or anywhere else, every time you have the urge to go and rescue Muslim women, please ask them what is their conception of Muslims' rights in India. Right? So this idea, and again, I said this in the beginning, that one of the things that why cultural rights are poor cousins of other human rights is the idea that the nation state is the sovereign that nobody can question. Number one. Two, gender rights are something that are used as a proxy to sort of discourage all kinds of conversations about minority rights. And show me a community which is not patriarchal. And what happens as a result of this whole sort of exceptionalism about Muslim patriarchy is that actually all conversations are hijacked by Hindu right wing. Let me give you two examples, very recent example. So in Udupi there's a school where suddenly boys turn up wearing saffron stoles, and they're saying, well, these girls should take off. So they're insisting on disrobing the girls. They're saying they've been wearing this garment over their heads. It's obnoxious for us, disrobe them. School says, don't wear it, otherwise from tomorrow you can't come to the school. Big controversy, lands up in, various high and mighty courts in India. What do they discuss? Is hijab essential religious practice of Islam or not? That's what they're discussing. Is that what is being challenged? What about Muslim girls' right to attain education in schools? So, my theory that anything that happens to Muslim women becomes a controversy about Islam. Discuss their right to go to school. How is it that you can make, well, don't you wear coat in winters and no woolen clothes in summer and school uniform? School uniforms change all the time. Some schools have shalwar kameez, some schools require a dupatta, others don't require a dupatta. Why can't a scarf be part of a uniform? It can certainly. Second example, triple talaq. Any man in this country, if he is not a Muslim, can abandon his wife without, attracting legal sanctions. Good. So this is the example. So if Muslim women say, well, stop summary one-sided divorce. I also want to have a sane divorce. Is divorce end of life? भाई अभी तो इतने साल हमको लगे ये बोलते हुए कि रेप अगर हो जाता है तो that's not end of the life, वो जिंदा लाश नहीं है. But divorce is end of the life. Even in Muslim activist circles, why is divorce considered such a catastrophic thing? It's not end of the life. But in Islam, there's great, sort of tolerance for divorce, even though the religious thing is to discourage it. But so be it. If you can't live together, separate. That's the good thing to do. But in India or South Asian cultures, it's actually poverty and women's lack of economic autonomy that makes divorce such a catastrophic thing. Now what do? They're saying, let not this man divorce me summarily and render me homeless without any support, etc., etc. And what do? You go and actually criminalize the man. Because it's your opportunity to criminalize the Muslim male's body, incarcerate him and torture him and so on. It is definitely Muslim women's issue to challenge some of these things. And the idea that, if they are upholding cultural rights, then it is this is exactly what I meant, that in Indian civil society, the idea that for any community to uphold their cultural rights is regressive and anti-secularism. Why do we define secularism in such a way? That minorities should be shorn of their cultural specificity and only then you will be secular. So you will be secular until you, how is it that जो हिंदू है वो नॉर्म है. अब आप बड़ी बड़ी बिंदियां लगाकर आइए तो भी आप बहुत बड़ी फेमिनिस्ट हैं, लेकिन मेरा स्कार्फ अगर मैं पहन कर आऊंगी तो मैं ट्रेडिशनल हो गई, मैंने अपने दिमाग पे पर्दा डाल लिया, मैं सोच नहीं सकती. सो हिंदू सिंबल्स are feminist, but Muslim symbols cannot be feminist. A Muslim, is there any conception of feminism within Islam? Not in India. Sorry.
Can we take some more questions? Do you think 5 minutes?
Ma'am, customary rights रहेगा.
Yeah, I think I kind of, answered it in the sense that customary rights, if there are communities that want to assert certain kinds of rights and certain kinds of practices, then I think the right to self-determination is there. When there is this whole debate about uniform civil code, the idea that if there is a uniform law in the entire country, then every country will be one. Now, nobody asks, if you remove, number one, is uniform civil code only about abolition of Muslim personal law? That's how it is framed in the public sphere in India. That abolish Muslim personal law. Will that make India a uniform as far as civil laws are concerned? No. Now, the customary laws, what will happen to them when uniform civil code comes in force? Nobody, I'm sorry, but my mind boggles why we don't ask for these questions. So yes, I'm all for customary laws, and communities have a right to self-determination in determining how to preserve their cultures. Now, if there are certain impulses within cultures which are problematic for various subgroups within that culture, then the impulse to reform should come from within the culture. And if we had a truly benign and benevolent state, which was truly secular, and which all these minorities trusted that the state was the custodian of their rights, then the state could actually facilitate that process, right? So if Muslim personal law needs to be reformed, then I'm not saying that state has no say in it. But what kind of state has a say in it? Not the state that we are confronted with today.
Thank you very much, Vizala, and thank you very much for your questions. I think it was a really wonderful discussion. Thanks a lot to the organizers, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone. Now we'll leave for tea break. Please reassemble at 3:30 sharp because we'll begin our second session at 3:30. Thank you everyone. Thank you to chair and speakers and audience.